Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space. And as always, I hope that you enjoy. Story number 1. I think we underestimated the size of the human species by 8 or 9 orders of magnitude. In Babylon they wept. War Room was reading. The human population had been estimated in the mere 100 billion range. They should barely have had enough of an economy to field 2 light cruisers, least of all the goddamn armada that was ravaging their inner worlds. After the Alpha Strike, the human flotilla should have been completely crippled. Instead, the number of ships they were fielding kept growing. Tannhauser was the first target struck by the human attack, and they reported 17 craft before they lost comms. The Attican was hit just 3 days after that, but their reports already showed numbers above 90. Any doubts that the fleet was growing were eliminated when Outpost Baton reported 1,217 FTL pings 2 days before the loss of Kyra. The number of reports was so big it was written off as a sensor malfunction. 25 billion souls lost, all because nobody in the war room could face reality. They were going to face it now. Tyrion, in front of them, was the primary sensor engineer for the Baton outpost, a specialist with more expertise in analyzing space lanes than warships. He'd been up for at least the last 2 days, poring over the sensor data, and only now was ready to begin to share his findings. From the pain in his multifaceted eyes, it was clear that he was still reeling from the loss of his homeworld. Seeing that he had the room's attention, he began to speak. The translation units each member of the War Council had implanted experienced a moment of lag as they struggled to convert the almost musical tonal humming of the Kyrarian tongue to a more common galactic speech. The simplest data that can be analyzed from an FTL ping is the distance that the ship traveled before dropping to sublight. The contracted space in front of the craft traps small particles, the even light itself for a short period, compressing its waves and then releasing it when the field disengages. The war room nodded along. The explanation was mildly technical, but anyone that had traveled on an FTL shuttle before knew the hazards of exiting FTL directly in front of your home destination. Blasting your home station with a wave of alpha, beta, and ultraviolet rays was hardly a warm welcome. The engineer continued. The issue with this is that we're used to the majority of the ping being in the UV spectrum. We aren't entirely sure what the spectrum of the signals we got from the ships were, because Baton Station only detected up into the low gamma range. That's still what the majority of the human FTL pings were detected in. That's at least 10 billion times the frequency that we used to. Since the frequency of the burst can be roughly modeled by multiplying the mean radiation per unit distance by the length of the path, this implies one of 2 things. That the human ships were either traveling through areas with 10 billions of times the standard background flux, or they were traveling extragalactic distances. The engineer paused for a few seconds at that statement. The pain of loss still shone in his gemstone eyes, but something more immediate was beginning to take center stage. Fear. Because the craft is essentially throwing, normally it would be the next 3 or 4 days worth of cosmic background radiation at you. In our case, it's more like several decades, but because it's just giving you an advance on your normal cosmic background radiation, you can track the void in the next several days worth of background noise to determine the ship's approach vector. The 1,217 craft that arrived weren't coming from the same spot. There were actually hundreds of converging vectors. But, more importantly, we trailed off. A small 3D model of the local space appearing at the center of the holotable, a spiked ball of vectors protruding from the galactic disk, each piercing cleanly through its former homeworld. His voice cracked a little, the hum turning into a hiss. The translator's text paused a moment, too, struggling to convey the subtle emotion cues into a message. They're all coming from the galactic disk. That doesn't mean that they were surrounded. that doesn't just mean that we're outnumbered. It means that each attack that we've seen up to this point is from an entirely separate group. What we've been mistaking for fleets, I believe, are simply the beginning trickles of an exploratory force. Each of the sites that they have targeted hasn't been of significant strategic importance. They've just been sites with unusually strong output signals. I think they're just using our transmission stations as makeshift beacons for their FTL jumps. I think we underestimated the size of the human species by 9 orders of magnitude. There was a heavy silence in the war room as the last sentence was preceded. The engineer was already out the door before he heard the panic begin to set in. Part of him felt guilty. It would have been kinder for them to go out not knowing what was about to hit them. Still, it wasn't often you could force people with this much power to realize that they'd just lost everything. There was a bit of satisfaction in that. End of story. Story number 2. Humans have zero chill when it comes to technology. Written by Damaged Dice DM. As the advanced leader in technology for the GA Galactic Alliance, we are the Orthadians, are tasked with assessing new applicants' technical knowledge level for inclusion in the Alliance. Applicants are given a score based on a percentage of technical achievements as compared to our own. No race had ever achieved a score over 50%, and the humans were no different. They scored quite well in industrious metrics and mathematics, but were hampered by the lack of exotic metallurgy and material sciences. Due to Earth being a very young planet and lacking the gravity required to create some of the important exotic materials needed for faster-than-light tech and others. One area of technology they excelled at was shielding and weaponry. Apparently, they had been fighting each other for so long that a sort of stalemate between a weapon that could destroy almost anything and shields that could protect against almost anything had forced a peace stalemate. The standard test for technology level was for the planets to present their best minds. They would be tested on theory as well as practical subjects. One of the modules was hyperdrive FTL technology, which we already knew that they didn't have due to the aforementioned inability to manufacture suitable materials caused by a lack of gravity. They did quite well in theory and did much better than expected in identifying the parts and purpose of most of the engine when tested. In the end, it was decided that if they were to join, they would need to be supplied the materials and experts to make this technology feasible for them. This was good news for the Orthalians, as they were the only race that could supply such materials and experts. And this would put them in a very good position in trade, as it had with other races, basically allowing them to demand whatever they would want in return. They filed their report and informed the humans that they had received a score of 22% and that the Alliance would deliberate their application over the next 6 of their months. They did not seem pleased at the low score, even though it was quite respectable amongst the other member races. They asked how long until they could retest to challenge the result. We informed them that all retests would have to be done on Kexeldan, the Orthalian homeworld, and with their current spaceflight capability, the journey would take over 23 years. They appeared to resign themselves to the process and their low score. It was less than 2 of their months later when we received communication that they wished to retest. We again reiterated that all retests would have to be performed on Kexeldan. They confirmed they understood. Moments later, a ship appeared in low orbit, carrying a delegation from the human homeworld. At first, we were shocked and assumed that another race had sold the ship or passage to the humans, but this ship was unlike anything that we'd seen before. With permission, they landed, and we held several meetings with the delegation. From what we discerned, that they had indeed built the ship in the intervening time since we last met, and it was not only FTL capable, but was faster than even our current tech by an order of magnitude. Baffled by this development, we asked where they sourced the materials for the craft since they lacked the ability to make them. Turns out they did make them by producing them in the center of their own sun. They built a factory for it inside their sun. Apparently, they built a mobile factory, slapped enough shielding to it to make it survivable, just to craft the elements they needed for a drive, and flew it into their sun. They had also, in the few hours that they'd spent with our schematics, figured out enough for them to not only understand how to build it, but using their weapons and shield tech to improve it, basically turned the ship into an FTL gun that shot itself across the galaxy almost instantaneously. That was almost 200 years ago. And that brings us to today. After a long wait, we received our technology score in our bid to join the UTA, the United Terran Alliance. We managed a respectable 13%. Now, we wait for their decision. End of story. The algorithm reckons you should be watching this video next, and I recommend that you should be always watching my video. So, click with energy! And yes, clicking that does help the channel. Thank you very much. I just quickly want to thank the Tier 5 patrons and channel members: Alithia Barkey, Cam Maxwell, Casper Arnholtz, Albarden Guster, Arcadian, Lord Azrakal, and Joachim Backer.